start. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on today's Keep Up with Pryme. My name is Laura Andradas. I'm marketing lead at Pryme Global. And together with Aske Holst, product manager at Pryme Global, we will walk you through some of our new features. And we will also take a deep dive into invoice retention. Of course, we're going to leave some time at the end of the presentation for the Q&A. So feel free to use the section if you have questions during the presentation. So let's start with advanced projects. Let's see what's new for this application. So with regards to the integration with Dynamics 365 Sales, we have created an effective date field which allows you to control which opportunities should create projects in Business Central. Apart from this, there's the action of creating import templates from Project Expense Journal, Project Time Journal, and import projects. And this action will export an Excel sheet with header information. The contract task type defaults from the project contract type when manually adding a task to the project. And we also have new integration events for further customization. Moving forward to the Pryme apps, we have only seen application enhancements in terms of Pryme Time because most of our development team was on holiday the past few weeks. So let's see what's new for Pryme Time, our time tracking software. Now you can update your timesheet with work assignments without populating quantity. This way you can use the work assignments as a starting point without entering the actual hours. And the time entry pattern report is now to be found on the role center. So you can view data from the current and previous periods and download this information as an Excel file sheet. Well, I would like to tell you that we're running a campaign so that people who are still not using Pryme Time can run it for free for 3 months. The idea behind it is that you start using Pryme Time, you download the time entry pattern report, and then you start using all the Pryme Time features you have so that you can track time immediately after work is done. And then you run the report again after these 3 months. And hopefully you have seen an improvement in this pattern. And in case you are already using Pryme Time, what we offer you is that you can set up a call with us. And in this free session, we will show you how to get the most out of it. And now I would like to hand it over to Aske. And thank you very much for now. And we'll see each other at the end of Aske's demo. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And so we will start with advanced projects. As mentioned, there is a number of application enhancements. And first off, it is the integration with Dynamics 365 Sales. One of the points of feedback that we've gotten is that it should be possible to decide what opportunities to move over, especially if you're already running a CRM system, you have a lot of opportunities. When you turn on the integration, you don't necessarily want all the existing opportunities to create projects again. You probably have created those projects already. So in project setup, there is now an option to decide what the cutoff date would be. And usually you would set it to somewhere around the current date. And that will ensure that only new opportunities gets created as projects when you turn on the project integration setting to create projects based on opportunities. Secondly, we have new features for templating. The actual functionality for the template and project imports have not changed, but we made it easier to create those templates in Excel. And what we will see is that, for instance, in the expense journal. There has for a long time been a function to import expenses, and that requires you to supply an Excel sheet with the expense lines you would like to import. But you had to create that Excel file from scratch based on the columns needed. Now there's a very simple function. You simply press the create import template and it will download to your PC, and then you can open it up and it will have the correct columns, and it'll look something like this, where you have the columns and then you fill them in with the details, and then you can upload it afterwards. Similarly, we have the same in now the time journal. Also a button to create the import template, works exactly the same way. And we have it in the import projects function, where you can also create the template for importing projects, which then becomes a two-step process, because you create the template, fill it out, that fills out this list of projects to create, and then you would run the create projects action on this list. So if you want to use an Excel list instead of directly filling in the list here, you can do it with that template. Then there's some small enhancements. The contract task type now defaults from the project. That was a small annoyance on the project, where when you create a new task on a project, in the past, it would always default the contract type to be the same. Now, when you fill it in, the contract type here will be based on the contract type, which is set on the project card. So if this is set as a fixed project, then we would see that this would also become fixed task. And I will need to show more to show what kind of project it is. This is set as time and material. So all my new tasks will be time and material, but I could change that to fixed, and then all added tasks will be fixed. Small thing, but nice to have it. Next up, we have Pryme Time. The new feature here is that when you update your timesheet with work assignments, you can decide to do so without taking the planned number of hours from the work assignment. So again, based on customer feedback, there was a lot of approval and people who like the function to be able to create your timesheet based on your work assignments. So in my case, I have work assignments created for the work I'm planned to do, and I can use the update with work assignments button to fill in and get all the entries suggested for me. And that would look like this. This is the feature we've had for a long time in Pryme Time. The problem with that, of course, is that some people would not go in and put in the actual number of hours they work. They would just accept that this is probably good enough and submit the timesheet as is. So we made it a company-wide setting, and I'll delete my existing lines here just so we can start over, to instead enable you to say, yes, we still want you to have a starting point for entering your time, but we're not going to tell you the number of hours. You will have to input that so we know that it is truthful. That setting is found in project setup, and sorry, not in project setup, in Pryme Time setup, because this is part of Pryme Time. So in Pryme Time setup, there is now a checkbox to decide if you want to include hours with when importing work assignments. If I turn that off, go to my timesheet, and again use the update with work assignments feature, we will see that I now get the same entries, but the quantities are 0. If I look in the matrix view, I will see that I just have the lines of the task that I'm supposed to be working on. So again, a good starting point, but without forcing the hand of the user. The second part we have for the time Pryme Time is that the time entry pattern report that we presented in the June release is now also available as a part in the Role Center. So we showed that previously, that there is a report for the time entry pattern. And this is a report that opens up an Excel sheet. You can see when people are tracking their time versus when they actually performed the work. And so if there is a discrepancy, that probably means that they track their time after they performed the work, which could indicate that they are not exact in their time tracking, and they might be losing time in the time tracking, or they might be losing precision. The same content is now made available as a part in the Role Center. It shows up as a time entry pattern. Now I don't have any time entry for this period, so I would just look at the whole year and see this is the pattern for me. I can see that I have only made time entries on Thursdays and Fridays. And that was never the day I actually worked. This, of course, because this is a demo environment and I just create a bunch of time entries and it's never the right day. But in what we would like to see is an even distribution where all the time is spread out. I track time on Mondays and Tuesdays and Thursdays and Fridays, maybe Saturdays and Sundays, but it's evenly distributed. And by default, you always see it for yourself, but you can switch over to see it for all resources. So it's the entire company, but you cannot see the details of what people did. You cannot drill down into the entries and see that. You can only see the aggregate. What we do allow you to do is open this up in Excel. Again, because the Excel sheet includes the time entry details, we do not allow you to do that for everybody because this part is available in all role centers, and that might show you data that you shouldn't be able to see. But if I do it for only my data, I can go in and see why did it look like this. I can open this up in Excel and I get the Excel report with just my data. And so that would be a way to work with it. If you want to see the full data set for the entirety of the company, then you need to use the access to the time entry pattern report. And that, of course, can be controlled with permissions. So we're sure not to give permissions to everybody to look at the time entries for the entire company. We can limit that. This concludes the list of new features and changes we made in the product. And if there are no questions so far, I think we will go into the deep dive. The deep dive today is on retention invoicing. And retention invoicing is when you are invoicing for something, but you're not posting an invoice for the full amount. You're retaining part of that invoice for a later point in time, usually as part of a delivery approval, some kind of warranty, other agreement where you might invoice 90% now, and then after the customer has accepted or some time has passed and no problems has occurred in the delivery, then you can invoice for the remaining amount. This can be done in multiple different ways because there, of course, are multiple different ways of invoicing. You can define it on the project level if you are using direct invoicing in a time and materials or fixed price fashion. So on the project card of a project, I can set up the retention percentage. This is the percentage of the invoice amount that I want to retain. So I could set this to 10%. Then it will ask me if I want to update my task because it is really set at the task level. And you could set different percentages per task, but usually it is a common percentage. So it allows you to update the task. And now all of my tasks have 10% retention. This means that when I go to bill this project, I can open up invoice suggestion. I can, of course, from there, see all the entries I have, and I can create an invoice. And on that invoice, there will now be lines for the amounts retained that should amount to 10% of the total for the entries. The idea being that you can then later invoice for that. So looking at my invoice, which has a lot of lines in this case, we can see there is the first section here being all the lines we are invoicing for. And then further down, we will see that we have lines where we are retaining some amount, and that is in general 10% of the amounts we have up here. To be aware of is that the grouping of the retention on the invoice is by task, and that's because the retention percentage is set by task. So even though I have grouping here by individual, I do get the retention grouped by task. And that's the way it is. If you need a special description on this to make it clear what it is, you can always go in and change the descriptions to make it fit better to what the customer expects the description to be. But there's a default description with a task number and the type of posting this is. This is really the product posting group name we're using here. So if I post this, I will then post for the full amount, but I will have 10% retention, and I need to do a bit of, I should actually do it on another project. This was a bad example. So let's see what we have in here. If we have something else we can invoice on. I do not. So that was a bad example. I might get away with making a small change here on my project. That's always the thing when you're testing things out and demoing. You might end up in a scenario where you have a connection that was not supposed to be for that. So let's go back here and go to our invoice suggestion, find our document, and try to post that once again and see if that works better. And it doesn't. So I will need to find another project. Let's take this one, demo 4, and I will set it up for retention once again. And let's post some time entries. So here, delete the lines, create something for demo 4. Submit the timesheet. So we have some entries to invoice. I'll need to approve those as well, of course. And now we should be good to go as we now have chargeable time and there is retention on this project, meaning we can open up the demo 4 and we can create an invoice and we should see some retention there and we should be able to post it. So again, one line here for the total amount, 2,160. One line for the retention. We can post this. And now, of course, the total amount on the invoice is less than the original because we retain 10%. So we created this document, and now we have a retained amount, the 216. And time goes, the customer is satisfied. We come back maybe a year later when the warranty time has expired, and then we can do an invoice for the remaining retention. And we can open that up with what we call retention invoicing. And here we have all the entries. We can see we have this entry for the 10%, the 216. And based on that, we can then create an invoice for that retention, and that invoice we then post, and with that the whole full amount is then invoiced to the customer. And this process for retention basically applies to all kinds of invoicing. I showed it for time and material, but you can do exactly the same thing if we work with scheduled billings. So if we set up a scheduled billing here for a certain amount and there is retention on the task we set it up for, when we bill that out, there will also be the same retention. So that's something to be aware of. Maybe you don't want to have retention on your scheduled billings part. You want to handle that as separate scheduled billings. Then you just need to make sure you exclude those tasks that you use for the scheduled billings from retention, or maybe that is part of what you want to do. You want to use the retention to retain some of that. So you can do that as well. It also works with the percent complete billing. It will do the same kind of retention. Also works with progress billing. The difference with progress billing is that for progress billing, you have to specify what the retention percentage is. So if I set this up, we can see that here it does take the 10% from the project, but I can override it, and then that retention percent becomes the default for the progress billing I'm doing. And I can even, on the line level of my progress billing, set a specific retention percentage out here to show what will be the retention. So slightly different, bit more control, as you can set it per line you bill. But in the end, everything ends up in the retention invoicing screen, where we can see all the entries that we need to create invoices for in the end. To round this off, I'll also mention that we have a completely different retention concept, which is subcontract retention. And subcontract retention is, of course, when you have something subcontracted out using a subcontract, basically a purchase order for labor or production of some kind, you can set up retention for that. And that is a similar mechanism, but of course it is on the purchase side and not the sales side. And that also means that you have to, of course, agree with your subcontractor on who manages the retention. Because if they are subtracting something on their side, should you also subtract something on your side, or how will you meet that invoice that you will later get for the remaining amount? So something to consider when using subcontract retention, but it's exactly the same principle, just on the purchase side. And this concludes our look into retention invoicing.